In Exodus chapter 19, verses 9 to 15, we see God's special endorsement of Moses. God has chosen Moses to be his servant. And Moses had proven himself as a specially anointed servant of God. And he would once again reinforce this truth. The ancient concept of holiness, which we read about and which Moses tries to explain to us, this is largely because holiness regards the idea of God in itself as a holy God. Ancient people apart spent much time thinking about God, and the belief was that the world indeed was made by a God. But this God was essentially different from people. God was holy and the people were different. They were profane and worldly. Holiness was associated with the notion of godly perfection. The case of a God of love arises in the Old Testament, together with the notion of covenant, and it comes in the fruition in the work of Christ. So within the idea of holiness, there is this basic separation between God and humanity, which is obvious within this text that we have read. God is holy, and if people are to approach Him, they must do what God says and take suitable precautions. Most of today's text explains the precautions relevant for God's coming to deliver His commands to Israel, and these were necessary to prevent them from being consumed by His awesome power. We might wonder whether this text describes Mount Sinai as somewhat holy. This mountain is generally thought to be the one that is called Gebal Musa in the Sinai range of the southern Sinai Peninsula. And sometimes people who have been to this mountain, they say that they feel something there, something that is different. But we note that God reserved a special place for Moses. In verse 9, he said that he would come to Moses in a thick, visible cloud, so that the people could hear what he had to say, also believe in Moses. This is a prediction of what would shortly take place when Moses went up the mountain of God to receive the law and bring it to the people, which we read about in Exodus chapter 20. We must be careful, however, for we will find that Moses may not have been up the mountain on this first giving of the law. As part of the preparation that the people have to undergo in order to confront this holiness of God is consecration. Consecration comes from being obedient to the Word of God about how to approach Him. The rules about this would appear strange to us. For example, why did God require the clothes to be washed? Firstly, it may be that God's instruction may well have included other things that are not recorded here, because it's generally understood what they needed to do in order to come before their God. What we fail to appreciate today is that holiness, alongside its opposite human quality of profanity, were regarded as contagious. One example of this is the idea that touching the mountain will bring a person in contact with the holiness of God and therefore kill them. In this light, we see that the instruction to wash the cloak, the outer garment, meant that if people touched each other, they would not be affected by any uncleanliness of the individual wearing that cloak. To us, this seems rather strange, but it was preparation for holiness before God. And we notice that this preparation goes down to the smallest details. Any uncleanliness in the presence of God is unacceptable. There is some speculation about the meaning of the third day mentioned in this passage. Of course, Jesus was raised on the third day, and something that there may have been a connection to Jesus' resurrection and the divine presence of God. This may be worth exploring, but there is no evidence in the New Testament or elsewhere that the Christians of the early church noticed this connection, so that it may be unwise for us to place too much stress on it, but nevertheless, it is an interesting thought. Essentially, a period of 3 days was considered an appropriate period of time for ritual purification. And there are numerous different Old Testament references to 3 days, each with its own significance and meaning. Verses 12 and 13 are a difficult part of the text for us today. They describe the limits set around the mountain because of the holiness when touched by the presence of God. We may understand the difference between God's holiness and people's sinfulness. And we may appreciate that the whole of the mountain will become holy and should not be trespassed upon. Or why should those who touch the mountain die? Further, the next verse explains that God does not enact the death sentence himself, but other people must do this by stoning or shooting with arrows. Again, we may even understand that the reason for stoning is to prevent touching the one who has sinned and being infected. This is quite dreadful. There are two possible ways to answer this question. Number one, is the first one, we must place ourselves in the position of an Israelite and appreciate the importance of being obedient to God at that time. God had set out the conditions under which he would meet the people, and the actions of one individual could undermine the acceptability of everyone to God. If one man had sinned, they all pay the price. The crossing of God's boundaries was a terrible crime for those days, even if because of the mercy of God, today it is not so. A second reason is this, possible reason. As we saw earlier, holiness was a matter of life and death. And contrary to people today who regard such a notion as fanciful, ancient people would have taken the matter as deadly to the community. In the same way that we read a sign that says, high voltage electricity, do not enter, and keep a healthy distance. The words in verses 11 and 12 would have had a similar impact upon the people of Israel. The fact was that people did not go near the mountain or touch it, for that meant death. Thank you.